Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Tyree and my restoration project is called 90 Seconds with the Early Church. Initially when I picked this title, my plan was to spend about a minute and a half addressing the topics that I've chosen to address. But as I've done more research, I realized that most of these videos will probably be more than 90 seconds, so the title is kind of misleading, so I apologize for that. But for this project, I decided to do some in-depth study on early church members or people who had affiliations with the early church, just to find out more interesting facts about them. And so I picked 10 people that I thought either had interesting stories or were vital to early church history. Those people are Joseph Smith, Emma Smith, Wilford Woodruff, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, John Tanner, Eliza R. Snow, Lyman Johnson, Thomas B. Marsh, and Jane Manning. In these videos, I'm going to be talking about each of these individuals and just telling interesting stories or facts that I found out about them, just so hopefully through this project we can both come to have more personal knowledge about members of the early church and just the things that they went through and the conversion stories that they have. So I hope you find these next 10 videos interesting and enlightening. I apologize as well because sometimes I may look at my notes for reference, and so I won't always be staring at the camera, but hopefully that won't distract y'all too much. So the first person we're going to be talking about today in this video is Joseph Smith. And before I get started into kind of the details of his life and just different stories that I found, I wanted to read a scripture from Doctrine and Covenants 135, verse 3. It's just a part of that verse, but it says, Joseph Smith, the prophet and seer of the Lord, has done more, save Jesus only, for the salvation of men in this world than any other man that has ever lived in it. That's such a powerful scripture, and I think it just describes what a great man and what a great influence Joseph Smith was for the early church. There are so many amazing things that Joseph Smith did in his lifetime, and in this video I want to keep it kind of short, so I'm not going to be able to cover all those things, but just things that I personally found important. So I hope that as I kind of go through these different things that y'all will be able to feel the spirit and just find out things that you didn't know before about Joseph Smith. So the first story that I found super interesting about Joseph Smith was the story of his leg. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this story, but I think it shows, well, it's about Joseph Smith at a young age, and I think it shows what a powerful, strong, and compassionate man he was going to grow to be from the story. So when Joseph Smith was 7 years old, him and his family were living in New Hampshire, and there was this really deadly epidemic of the typhus, or the typhoid is kind of how we call it now, fever that spread around the community, and all of the Smith children contracted the fever. But eventually over time, all of them recovered except for Joseph Smith, and he got this infection in his leg from this fever. And many great physicians who lived around him at the time, they tried different techniques to try to heal his leg, different medicines and methods, but none of them were working. And so according to the practices of the time, Joseph Smith, he was going to have his leg amputated. But he refused amputation. And so a doctor at a nearby university or medical school, Nathan Smith, he agreed to perform a new surgical procedure on Joseph's leg, which was he was going to have to cut through Joseph's leg, his bone, to new bone growth in order to extract the infected bone from the exterior cavity. Joseph assured his parents and his physicians that he could endure the experimental surgery, because I mean, if you think about it, they're cutting through bone marrow, and that is like one of the most painful processes that, or surgical procedures that happen, so I'm told. But he told them he could endure it without any alcohol to kind of like calm his nerves and dull the pain, or cords to bind him to the bed to keep him from moving. And he told his father if he would only just hold him during the surgery, and if his mother would leave the room, then he could do it. And so he's quoted to have said that, "I will do whatever is necessary to be done in order to have the bone taken out. The Lord will help me. I shall get through." And I was just blown away by how powerful Joseph Smith already was as a 7-year-old boy. Like, I don't know about y'all, but when I was 7, I don't know. I actually don't really remember when I was 7, but I don't think I could have endured that. But during the surgery, Dr. Smith, he cut out the infected part of Joseph's leg, and it was a kind of a long process and a long surgery, but they were able to remove all of the infection, and eventually Joseph Smith was able to heal, although he always kind of had a limp when he walked from that surgery. I was really just astounded at the strength that Joseph Smith had at 7 years old, and I think that really, his reaction to that experience, it really showed what type of man he would grow up to be. Even as a young man, we know that Joseph Smith, he had questions about religion and which church should join, and we all are familiar with the first vision and how he prayed to Heavenly Father to know which church to join, and Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him and told him not to join any of the churches, and they further revealed to him that he was going to be the prophet of the restoration, to restore all things to the earth. And that was at a young age, 14 years old. And so again, I think that shows what an amazing young man Joseph was, and he continued to be amazing as he grew later in his years. Like I said before, we're not going to be able to talk about all the amazing things that he did, but he translated the Book of Mormon. That's how we have the Book of Mormon today. And he received very many revelations that are vital to our church doctrine today. But one other experience that I really wanted to focus on with Joseph Smith was his experience in Liberty Jail. Because for me, that personally is one of the most powerful stories and the most powerful revelation that came from that time. We know that Joseph Smith, he was unjustly placed in Liberty Jail for a time for crimes that he didn't really commit. And in that time, the saints were going through a lot of hard things. And Joseph Smith, at one time, he prayed out to Heavenly Father, kind of questioning, why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to the church? And some really beautiful revelations came from that time that he had in Liberty Jail. The prophet Joseph Smith, he actually compared the experience that he had in Carthage jail to a trial equal to Abraham. But Joseph Smith, because of his faith and the strong person that he was, and being able to rely on Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ, he endured through his time there. And finally, after 5 months being unjustly imprisoned there, he and his companions, the people that were with him, were able to get away from the guards and travel back home. Again, in June 1844, Joseph Smith was unjustly imprisoned again with his brother Hiram Smith and a few other men. And during their time there, a mob broke in and killed Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. I think that Joseph Smith was just such a powerful man, and he truly was willing to live for the Savior and for the gospel of Jesus Christ, but also as well to die for it. And of the prophet, the Lord said, "I did call upon Joseph Smith by mine angels, my ministering servants, and by my own voice out of the heavens, to bring forth my work, which foundations he did lay and was faithful. And I took him to myself. Many have marveled because of his death, but it was needful that he should seal his testimony with his blood, and he might be honored, and the wicked might be condemned. Joseph Smith, there's so many amazing things that he did that I keep on saying, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to cover more of them, but I think what we can learn from him and his life, the way that he lived, is that we need to have faith in Jesus Christ at all times so that we can get through the easiest and the hardest of trials. Emma Smith was born July 10th, 1804 in Harmony, Pennsylvania to Isaac and Elizabeth Hale. The family was quite wealthy, and Emma, as she grew up, she developed a deep sense of religious conviction and devotion to God. And at a young age, she began attending the Methodist Church. When she was 21 years old, that's when she met Joseph Smith. And even though they came from very different worlds, very different backgrounds, she was impressed by the character that he had. And they courted for several months. And even though her parents didn't approve, they eloped in 1827. And then they went to live with Joseph Smith's family. They returned to Pennsylvania in December to live near her family and work on the translation of the Book of Mormon, where even though she was never able to see the plates, she helped with the translation of the Book of Mormon. In 1832, soon after her baptism into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, she began selecting hymns to be sung in church meetings, and she worked with W.W. Phelps to print some of them in the church newspapers. The first Latter-day Saint hymn book was printed in Kirtland in 1835 under Emma's name. She provided so much service to the church. She presided over the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo from its founding in 1842 until 1844, providing relief to new immigrants and destitute families. Her service in the Relief Society, however, achieved much more than benevolent work. As president, she taught the women of the Relief Society doctrine. She helped manage membership, and she publicly defended principles of moral purity. She was the first woman to receive her temple endowments or temple ordinances, and she then initiated other women in these temple ordinances. A lot of people, when they think of Emma Smith, they think about the struggle that she had with plural marriage when that policy was introduced into the church, and that she struggled with that, and she shifted her perspective and support back and forth over time. Joseph Smith's death in 1844 created tremendous upheaval for Emma. There are disagreements that erupted between her and Brigham Young. And so when most of the saints left for Salt Lake to trek there, Emma stayed in Nauvoo with her children. She remarried a man named Louis Benamon. He was a non-member of the church who lived in Nauvoo. And then in 1860, Emma affiliated with the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ, which was led by her son. And I think a lot of people in the church, they kind of have mixed feelings about Emma Smith. But even though all of the things that happened to her and her kind of estrangement from the church after Joseph Smith died, she was interviewed later in her life, and she still had a very strong testimony of the Book of Mormon. She was quoted to say, "My belief in the Book of Mormon is that it is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it." Emma Smith died in April of 1872, and she was buried next to Joseph Smith. Her name and character have been both revered and misunderstood in Latter-day Saint memory, but there's no denying that her influence had such a huge impact on the church. Next, I'm going to be talking about Martin Harris. Martin Harris was born in 1783 to his parents who were farmers. But in the next 45 years of his life, he would build a very comfortable life for himself. And then at age 45, after building up all this wealth and working really hard, he wanted to kind of rest from kind of all of his labors and just kind of enjoy all the things that he had done, all the wealth that he had worked for. So he even considered hiring someone to run his farm for him so that he could travel with his wife and his family. But when he started to think about this, he received a visit from Lucy Smith, Joseph Smith's mother, who told him about Joseph Smith's decision. Joseph and his family were not in a position to pay for the translation, but Martin Harris was, and Lucy Smith, she knew that, so she asked if Martin would come and visit Joseph. And Martin said that he would, and his wife Lucy also was quite thrilled and insisted that she could come along also. But Martin, he probably harbored some doubts. He later told an interviewer that when he'd heard the story of the plates, he assumed that Joseph and his money-digging friends had simply found an old brass kettle. Still, Martin, he was a religious man, and I think it was probably his openness to the presence of the supernatural in his daily life that allowed him to at least consider Joseph's claims. His wife, Lucy Harris, however, she promptly promised to visit Joseph, and she even offered to help finance the translation of the plates herself, which was a pretty big deal. Martin, however, he remained kind of aloof, perhaps thinking he needed some time to think it over. But during the fall and early winter, hostile neighbors of Joseph Smith attempted to steal the plates from him. And so, even though Martin may still have had reservations, he gave Joseph money so that he could, quote, do the Lord's work. Lucy Smith, however, began to doubt Joseph Smith's story, possibly because she had never seen the plates and she wanted to see them. But this suspicion that she had for Joseph Smith's story now led her to resent Martin, and their relationship became quite strained, and caused there to be a rift between them. During the spring and early summer of 1828, Martin scribed for Joseph Smith as he dictated the translation of the Book of Mormon. And though the process was quite miraculous, Martin still had reservations about it. He once replaced Joseph Smith's seer stones with another stone to see if Joseph would notice the difference. And then when Joseph wasn't able to translate the Book of Mormon, Martin confessed to having switched the stones, and Joseph asked him why he'd done it, and Martin explained that he wanted to, quote, stop the mouths of fools, close quote, who had told him that the prophet had learned those sentences and was merely repeating them. Even though Martin, he came to really sincerely believe in the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith as a prophet, his wife Lucy was concerned with the financial risk of paying for the publications of the Book of Mormon, and she was afraid that her peers would mock her for her husband's involvement with Joseph Smith. And she was kind of hurt that it seemed like Martin had left her feelings out of the calculations. She was also stung by the way Joseph Smith rebuffed her every attempt to see the plates, and she begged Martin to show her some evidence that of Joseph's ability to translate. So to ease Lucy's mind, Martin asked Joseph if he could take some of the manuscript home to show his family and friends. And we all know the story of how the 116 pages were lost. And so Joseph Smith asked the Lord told him no. And Martin was like, please ask him again. And so Joseph did that, and the Lord told him no again. And Martin was just like, please ask him again. And so Joseph asked the Lord again, and the Lord said, okay, fine, he can take them. And so he told Martin that he could take them on the condition that he only showed them to his wife, his parents, brother, and sister-in-law. So Martin was super excited, and he returned home and showed them to his wife. He didn't, however, handle them with a lot of care and security, and they were soon lost. Exactly how exactly how the manuscript was lost is a matter of speculation. One commonly repeated rumor was that Lucy removed the papers from Martin's bureau and burned them, although she denied any responsibility for the loss. Some, including Joseph Smith, suspected a conspiracy on the part of Lucy Harris, or perhaps others. Martin, he made every attempt to find the manuscript, and he even ripped open the bed and his pillows trying to find it, but he was never able to recover the manuscript. Although Martin Harris is often remembered for the loss of the 116 pages of the manuscript, Elder Dallin H. Oaks of the First Presidency has said that Martin's sacrifice to finance the printing of the Book of Mormon was one of Martin's greatest contributions to the church, for which he should be honored of all time. If you think about it, when at one time Martin was one of the most socially and politically prominent members of the community, his support of Joseph Smith and the church cost him his political office, his social position, and ultimately helped lead to the end of his marriage. Even so, Martin remained faithful to his church and to Joseph for many years, serving as a missionary, as a high counselor. In a period of intense conflict in Kirtland, however, he and other church leaders lost confidence in Joseph Smith and separated from the church. Although he was rebaptized in 1842, Martin did not rejoin the church community until 1870, when he was 87 years old. Many people heard him testify of what he had seen and heard as one of the three witnesses, and one reported him saying, "Do I believe it? Do you see the sun shining? Just as surely as the sun is shining on us and gives us light, and the moon and the stars give us light by night, just as surely as the breath of life sustains us, so surely do I know that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God, chosen of God to open the last dispensation of the fullness of times. So surely do I know that the Book of Mormon was divinely translated. I saw the plates. I saw the angel. I heard the voice of God. I know that the Book of Mormon is true and that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God. I might as well doubt my own existence as to doubt the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon or the divine calling of Joseph Smith." Martin Harris died in 1875, solid in his testimony of the Book of Mormon and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Next, we're going to be talking about Oliver Cowdery, who was also one of the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon. Oliver was born in 1806, and he was raised as a Congregationalist in that religion. In 1828, however, when he was 22 years old, he was a school teacher in New York, and he boarded with Joseph Smith's parents. After he arrived in the area, he started hearing strange stories about the Smith family and about Joseph Smith, and he was curious about what was going on. And eventually Joseph Smith's father explained Joseph Smith's experiences with the first vision. And when Oliver heard this, he wanted to know if these things were true, and so he prayed. And he talks of the experience, and he says that a peace came over him, convincing him that God had spoken and confirming the stories he heard. For a time, he told no one of this experience, even though he often spoke of the golden plates and gradually came to believe God was calling him to be a scribe for Joseph Smith. When the school term ended in the spring, Oliver traveled to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Joseph Smith was living with his wife, to offer his services to be a scribe for Joseph Smith. Oliver, he came to Harmony believing that he was supposed to be there to help translate, but as he got there and he started helping with the translation of the Book of Mormon, he questioned what else he could possibly be there for, or what else the Lord had in store for him. And as Joseph and Oliver continued the work of translation, Oliver had a greater desire. He wanted to play a greater part in the translation of the Book of Mormon. In Doctrine and Covenants, there's a revelation given for Oliver Cowdery in which the Lord promised him an opportunity to translate, and he wanted to claim that opportunity. Soon after, Joseph Smith dictated another revelation in Doctrine and Covenants, and where the Lord assured Oliver that he would have the gift that he desired. The requirements were faith and an honest heart. Although we have very few details as to Oliver Cowdery's attempt to translate, it apparently didn't go very well. Joseph received another revelation counseling Oliver, and it said, "Be patient, my son, for it is wisdom in me, and it is not expedient that you should translate at this present time." Oliver was also told he didn't understand the process. He was told, "You must study it out in your mind, then you must ask me if it be right, and if it is right, I will cause that your bosom should burn." While discouraged by his failed attempts to translate, Oliver dutifully remained a scribe to Joseph as he dictated the translation from the plates. Oliver later wrote, "These were days never to be forgotten, to sit under the sound of a voice dictated by the inspiration of heaven, awakened the most gratitude of this bosom." And so when Joseph and Oliver came to the account of Jesus' personal ministry to the Nephites, they began to wonder if anyone in their day had authority to administer the true church of Christ. They were especially concerned about baptism. On May 15th, 1829, they left the Smith home, where they were working to find a secluded spot to pray in a wooded area. Whatever doubts Oliver Cowdery may still have entertained certainly vanished when the resurrected John the Baptist descended in a cloud of light, and having laid his hands upon us, said, "Upon you, my fellow servants, in the name of the Messiah, I confer the priesthood of Aaron, which holds the keys of the ministry of angels and of the gospel of repentance and of baptism by immersion for the remission of sins." The experience cemented Oliver's faith. He later wrote, "Where was room for doubt? Nowhere. Uncertainty had fled. Doubt had sunk." As he continued on in his life, Oliver was a great help to the church. He was one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, like we already talked about. He helped in overseeing the printing of the Book of Mormon. He served as the church recorder once the church was established. He led many missionaries through Ohio and Missouri. And although he was excommunicated in 1838, he requested and received readmission to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1848. And I think his story is very powerful to teach us that revelation comes in the Lord's time and in his way, and that we have to be patient and trust in that. The next person we're going to be talking about is Eliza R. Snow. Eliza grew up religious. She grew up as a Baptist. And in her early teens, she became acquainted with religious reformers and scholars such as Alexander Campbell and Sidney Rigdon. They helped her study the scriptures, and she was said to be a very brilliant and avid pupil. In her childhood, Eliza began writing poetry, and her abilities were soon recognized. She was asked to write a requiem for John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were former presidents of the United States, upon their deaths. Yeah, so she was pretty awesome. One of her mottos was prove all things and hold fast that which is good. And so when the prophet Joseph Smith called at her parents' home during the winter of 1830 and 31, she had the opportunity to examine the principles of the gospel as taught by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She later wrote in her journal that the prophet had an honest face, and after careful investigation, she was baptized on April 5th, 1835. The year of 1835, when Eliza was baptized, proved to be a very critical time in her life, especially because of the publication of her poems. She became famous and sought after by many people. She had an autograph album that contained signatures from the Queen of England, Charles Dickens, Abraham Lincoln, Susan B. Anthony, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, just to name a few. In 1837, she said goodbye to her family and went to join the Saints in Kirtland, Ohio. Eliza was a powerful woman, and she went about doing so much good, and she had so much faith, and she inspired so many people. Leaving Far West, when they were kicked out by the mob, she walked ahead of the teams in an effort to warm her freezing feet. A member of the militia rode up and taunted her and said, "Well, I think this will cure you of your faith." But Eliza replied, "No, sir. It'll take more than this to cure me of my faith." And I think that's such a powerful example. Like, I can't imagine being thrown out by a mob and having to walk in the cold, barefoot, freezing, and yet still holding so strongly to the faith that she had. Such a powerful example. Clarissa Spencer, a daughter of Brigham Young, wrote of Eliza R. Snow, "She was slight and fragile and always immaculate in dress. I see her now in her full-skirted, lace-trimmed silk dresses with her dainty lace caps and a gold chain around her leg, looking for all the world like a piece of Dresden china. She always sat on Brigham Young's right at the dinner table and also in the prayer room. He valued her opinion greatly and gave her many important commissions, especially in relation to the women's organizations of the church. Her numerous duties in this capacity earned for her the quaint title of Presidentess." Though fragile, Eliza was an amazing organizer. She served as General Relief Society president for 21 years, from 1866 to 1887. She was also instrumental in organizing the Retrenchment Society under President Young's direction. On the morning of December 5th, 1887, she died. She wasn't ill with any disease. She just died of old age. And she requested that no black be worn at her funeral. Despite the sorrows, the frustrations, and the trials of Eliza's life, she continued to shine forth with righteousness. Then maybe be comforted by her example and resolve to follow Jesus Christ the way that she did, with such strength and resolve. The next person we're going to be talking about is Wilford Woodruff, who would eventually become the fourth president of the church. But as I was studying President Woodruff, I was reading about his conversion story and how he kind of came in contact with the church, and I was kind of struck by how similar it was to Joseph Smith's. Wilford Woodruff, he was born in Connecticut in 1807. And like Joseph's family, his family was relatively religious. But because of Wilford's association with a man named Robert Mason at a pretty young age, he realized that the churches that were on the earth at the time didn't have all of the principles and the doctrine that were on the earth at Christ's time. And so he was constantly searching for a church that had those attributes. And then in 1833, after many years of searching, he heard missionaries proclaiming the restoration of the true Church of Jesus Christ and how it was built upon prophets and apostles, and he knew that the church had been restored to earth. He knew that was the church that he needed to join. So he was baptized very soon after. Less than a year after his baptism, he was called as a missionary to Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky, where he proclaimed the gospel there. He went over to serve to serve and preside over many more missions, and to serve as a member of the 70, as a member of the Quorum of the 12. And after the death of John Taylor, he became the 4th president of the church in this dispensation. During his time as president of the church, President Woodruff received revelation on the manifesto that ended plural marriage. He strongly urged church members to participate in family history work and temple work, and he also instructed parents who were members of the church to make sure they were bringing up their children in the Lord. He had a great impact on the church while he was president, from April of 1889 to September of 1898, when he died at age 92. But even today in the church, we can still see the influence that he left. The next person we're going to be talking about is John Tanner, which I'm very excited to talk about this. He was one of my favorite people to do research on and to learn about. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any pictures of him, and so there's going to be, the pictures that are shown in this video are going to be like pictures of an actor depicting him. So sorry about that, but I love the story of John Tanner, how he came into the church and all the amazing things that he did while he was in the church. I wasn't able to find much background on his life, but I know that he was crippled later in life because of a disease in his leg. And the doctors around him, they weren't able to find a cure for that, and they were like, it's gonna have to be amputated if you want to live. And John said, that's not gonna happen. I guess he just didn't want to get his leg amputated. He was willing to die. I don't know. But so he decided with the time that he left in his life that he was going to do as much good as he could. And he saw that missionaries were coming to speak at a local place where he lived, and he decided that he was going to go so that he could set them straight and make sure they didn't lead people astray. When he got to this meeting of where the missionaries spoke, he sat in the very front and he listened to the missionaries as they talked about the restoration of the gospel and the apostasy and the Book of Mormon and the priesthood and different things. And as he sat there and listened, he never interrupted them or said they were wrong. He didn't try to put them in their place. And when the meeting was over, he said to his son that was with him, I want to meet with those missionaries. And so his son went up to the missionaries and brought them down to introduce him to his father. And John said, he said to the missionaries, would you like to come to my home and talk more about the gospel? And so the missionaries did, and they talked for many hours into the morning. And finally, at the end of it, John said, if I weren't a cripple, I think I would like to apply for baptism. And one of the missionaries said, I think he could if he wanted to. Then the missionaries, they quoted a scripture from James in the Bible about how the elders of the church healed the sick. And they said, we're elders and we hold the priesthood of God. Would you like us to administer to you? And John said yes. And so they did. They gave him a blessing and they administered to him. And that very day, John was able to get up and walk. And he walked the 3/4 miles to be baptized. and he never went back into his wheelchair. He was fully healed of his crippled leg. From the moment that John joined the church, he gave everything to the gospel and to the church. He supplied 50 plus men to go to Zion's camp, and a few months later he paid for 7 families to go to Kirtland in Missouri. I didn't mention this before, but John Tanner, he was a self-made wealthy man, so he had a lot of money. And as he and his family prepared to join the saints in Kirtland, John sold his hotel, several homes, a farm, a dairy, a sawmill, an island, and more than 2,000 acres of timberland. However, early in December of the same year, the church was in huge financial trouble. The temple land was about to be foreclosed on, and the church didn't have money to pay for it. And so the brethren prayed that the Lord would send them a means by which they could pay off the temple loan and keep the temple. That night, John awoke from a dream in which he was told, or he felt, that he needed to be in Kirtland, that the saints needed him in Kirtland. And so his family prepared and left Kirtland immediately. And if John and his family would have arrived one day later in Kirtland, the temple land would have been foreclosed on and we would have lost the temple. But John paid off the $2,000 owed, and he took a bank note from Joseph in exchange. Along with saving the temple, he also loaned the temple committee $13,000, and he signed another note for $30,000, all while making generous donations to the temple fund. And then with the rest of the money that he had, he invested in hard cash to shore up the church-sponsored bank, but unfortunately it was foreclosed on, and John lost all of his money. But he continued to follow Joseph and the saints wherever they went, no matter how little money they did have. At one point, on their travels from Kirtland to Nauvoo, John and his family were actually begging for bread. And then at the April conference of 1844, he was called on a mission to the eastern states. And while many of us, I think, would have thought about, I don't have money, what about my family? John, he gladly accepted the call and went. John Tanner is just such a strong example to me of faith and living the law of consecration, for sure. Because he literally gave all that he had to the church and to the gospel. It's estimated that overall John gave over $50,000 to the church. John Tanner, he didn't only understand the law of consecration, he lived it, for sure. Next, we're going to be talking about Lyman Johnson. Lyman Johnson was baptized into the church in Kirtland by Sidney Rigdon in 1831. After his family heard about the Book of Mormon and was very interested, and so they traveled up to Kirtland to further investigate the church, and most of them were baptized. After the time of his baptism, Lyman became anxiously engaged in the work and served many missions, and was eventually called to be a member of the Quorum of the 12. And during his time as a member of the Quorum of the 12, he also served and directed many missions. But the seed of apostasy began growing in Kirtland, and Lyman and many of his family members were affected by that. Lyman began using his connections to further his financial gains, and which eventually led to his apostasy. He accused Joseph Smith of speaking of and to members of the church disrespectfully, and this, among other things, eventually led to his apostasy. It's really sad to think about Lyman Johnson's apostasy because he was such a faithful man. I haven't really talked much about his background and how he became associated with the church, but it all happened in a relatively quick manner, just because of the spirit that he felt, testifying that the Book of Mormon was the word of God and that Joseph Smith was a prophet. And when he was called to the quorum of the 12 apostles, he was told that, or he was promised and blessed that his strength, in a sense, made Satan fear because of how strong and faithful he was to the church. And so it's sad to think about, in only 3 years, he fell away from the church. But even though he fell away from the church, he's still associated with a lot of his friends who were still members of the church. And he visited with many of his friends who lived in Nauvoo. And on one visit, he was talking to the quorum of the 12 at that time. And I just want to read what he said. He said, "If I could believe Mormonism, as I did when I traveled with you and preached, if I possessed the world, I would give it. I would give anything. I would suffer my right arm to be cut off, if I could believe it again. Then I was full of joy and gladness. My dreams were pleasant. When I awoke in the morning, my spirit was cheerful. I was happy by day and night, full of peace and joy and thanksgiving. But now it is darkness, pain, sorrow, misery, and the extreme. I have never since seen a happy moment." And he was talking about, since he had apostatized from the church. And according to Wilford Woodruff, Lyman Johnson was never rebaptized or rejoined the church. And pretty soon after his apostasy, he actually died from drowning. Even though Lyman Johnson did fall away from the church, he helped in the conversion of many members of the church while he served his many missions and as a member of the Quorum of the 12. When he was on one of these missions, actually, he preached a sermon which was remembered as, quote, "one of the most powerful testimonies pertaining to the mission of Joseph Smith." And so even though he did apostatize from the church, he did a lot of good, and he helped bring a lot of people to the truth. So next we're going to be talking about Thomas B. Marsh. Thomas Marsh, he was born in 1799 in Massachusetts. And at age 14, he ran away from home and began dabbling in different short-lived professions in Vermont and New York. He was very dissatisfied with the religions and the churches at the time, and so he kind of withdrew from all churches and decided that he would wait for the day where a new church, which was the true Church of Jesus Christ, would arise. And in 1830, he learned of the restored gospel, and he traveled to Palmyra, New York, where he met Martin Harris. And Martin Harris gave him 16 pages of the Book of Mormon that were fresh off the press. And Thomas Marsh, he took the pages back to Massachusetts, and he showed them to his wife, and she said that they were the translation of God. And so Thomas Marsh took his family, and they traveled to New York, where they were shortly baptized in the September of 1830. And then in the following year, the beginning of 1831, and once Thomas Marsh brought his family to Kirtland, Ohio, he was ordained a high priest. Marsh fulfilled many important callings in the church throughout his years. When he was first baptized, after he was ordained a high priest, in a revelation, he was called to be a physician unto the church. And it's unclear whether he was meant to be like a medical doctor or a spiritual healer, because, well, Thomas Marsh, he didn't have medical training. But he fulfilled that calling, and soon after, in Missouri, he served as a branch president and then on the High Council. And then in 1835, he was ordained a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And because he was 36 years old at the time, and he was the oldest member of the Quorum, he was set as the president of the Quorum. Promptly after his calling to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, he started to organize many missions to the eastern states. The Quorum at the time was made up of very young men who had very little experience and time within the church. And eventually 4 of those 12 men would be led to apostasy, but at the time, Thomas Marsh played a very important role in helping those young men to overcome their problems and their concerns and to remain faithful. Around the same time that President Marsh was in the eastern states overseeing those missions, President Joseph Smith called Heber C. Kimball to serve a mission and open up the missionary work in England. Upon hearing about this news of Heber C. Kimball being called to open the mission in London, President Marsh was offended that he hadn't been consulted because he was the president of the quorum at the time. Soon after this offense that was taken, Joseph Smith received a revelation from the Lord counseling President Marsh to be thou humble, and the Lord will lead thee by the hand. Even so, after this, after moving to Missouri, President Marsh became very critical of Joseph Smith. President Marsh and Orson Hyde signed an affidavit stating that the Mormons were violent and that they had concerns, and that became a prime piece of evidence used against the saints by the Missouri officials. I got a beam in my eye and thought I could discover a mole in Joseph's, he later recounted, though it was nothing but a beam in my eye. In October of 1838, President Marsh withdrew from the church, and he and his wife raised their family in Missouri. After his wife died in 1854, President Marsh sought readmittance into the church, and 3 years later, in 1857, he asked President Brigham Young, who was the president of the church at the time, if he could address the congregation. This is just a snippet of what he said. I do not know that I can make all this vast congregation hear and understand me. My voice never was very strong, but it has been very much weakened of late years by the afflicting rod of Jehovah. He loved me too much to let me go without whipping. I have seen the hand of the Lord in the chastisement which I have received. I have seen and known that it has proved he loved me. For if he had not cared anything about me, he would have not taken me by the arm and given me such a shaking. If there are any among this people who should ever apostatize and do as I have done, prepare your backs for a good whipping. If you are such as the Lord loves you. But if you will take my advice, you will stand by the authorities. But if you will go away and the Lord loves you as much as he did me, he will whip you back again. Many have said to me, he continued, how is it a man like you who understood so much of the revelations of God, as recorded in the book of the Doctrine and Covenants, should fall away? I told them not to feel too secure, but to take heed, lest they also should fall. For I had no scruples in my mind as to the possibility of men falling away. While assisting with church immigration, he was soon re-baptized into the church, and he eventually settled in Utah, where he lived the rest of his life. And I think a lot of people could pick at President Marsh's story and be like, why did he do this, or why didn't he do this? But what I've learned from studying about his life is the humility that he had. Maybe not at all times, because he did take offense to certain things, which eventually led to his apostasy, but he was humble enough to realize that he was wrong and to come back to the church and not deny the truthfulness of it, to know that he had to overcome his own faults and to be humble enough to seek readmittance into the church. And so I think that's the profound lesson that I learned from Thomas B. Marsh. And last but not least, we're going to be talking about Jane Elizabeth Manning James. She was one of the first African American women who was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She was born into a free black family in Connecticut in 1822. In 1828, when she was only 6 years old, she left her family in Connecticut and went to live with a wealthy white family who helped to raise her. She wasn't a slave, she was free, but she was their servant, but they still treated her very well. And so she grew up there. And when she was about 14 years old, she started investigating the Presbyterian church. That's the one she attended the most, but she still didn't feel very satisfied in the things that they taught, and she felt like there were things that were missing. She had belonged to the Presbyterian church for about 18 months when some missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ, the Latter-day Saints, they were traveling through where she lived, and they were going to preach a sermon there. She went on a Sunday to hear a sermon in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, just called the Church of Jesus Christ at the time. But and once she heard and visited there, she felt convinced that that was the true gospel of Jesus Christ. And just a week later, she was baptized and confirmed a member of the church. Soon after her baptism into the church, Jane and some of her family members and friends who were also members of the church, they felt a desire to join the saints in Nauvoo. And so they were planning on traveling there from Connecticut to New York by steamboats and canal boats. But because of their race, because they were African American, they were denied passage on those boats. And so they walked the 800 miles to get to Nauvoo. I was just so struck by how strong their testimonies must have been at that time. To walk 800 miles to be with the saints. And it wasn't an easy walk for them. I mean, 800 miles like that in itself is just very long. But they were questioned many times as being fugitive slaves from other states, and they were almost arrested on very many counts. But they still wanted to be with the saints in Nauvoo, and they kept going. And so once they reached Nauvoo, Jane began to grow very close with the Smith family, especially Emma and Joseph Smith. She worked in their house and lived with them. And at one point, Emma invited Jane to be adopted into the family through a priesthood sealing. But Jane didn't really understand all of the temple ordinances and the sealings and the things that they were doing at the time, and so she declined that. But she firmly believed in Joseph Smith's prophetic role. She was to have said of him, "I did know the prophet Joseph. He was the finest man I ever saw on earth. I was certain he was a prophet because I knew it." And I just love that because it's a very simple testimony, but it's very powerful. She was like, "I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet because I know it." And I love that. I love that, the simplicity of that, and the childlike nature, but yet strength that Jane Manning had. In 1846, Jane married a free African-American convert from New Jersey named Isaac James, and they had a son, Sylvester, together. And then in the next year, in 1847, the family left and traveled to Salt Lake. In 1870, however, there was some marital tension between Isaac. Okay, let's see. In 1870, however, there was some marital tension between Isaac and Jane, which led to their divorce. She had a brief 2-year marriage to another African-American convert, but that also ended. Throughout her life and all the difficulties that she had to face, Jane, she remained committed to her faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the church. She donated to the Temple Construction Fund, and she participated in the Relief Society. Jane later wrote, I quote, "My faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ is as strong today, nay, it is as if possible stronger than it was the day I was first baptized." And then between 1884 and the early 1900s, Jane would periodically contact church leadership like John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Joseph F. Smith to seek permission to enter the temple and participate in the ordinances there. But at the time, African American saints were not allowed to participate in temple ordinances. And although Jane was not able to participate in temple ordinances in her lifetime, she had a very strong testimony in them. And later, after she passed on, these ordinances, the temple ordinances, were performed in her behalf. And I think out of everyone's stories and backgrounds, I find Jane's to be one of the most powerful, because I think of how hard her life was, regardless of having the gospel in her life, but being a free African American woman, it couldn't have been easy in the time period that she lived in. But she still sought after truth, and what she found is she held on to that, and she sought to gain more truth. And I think her example is very powerful to us to be progressive in the gospel, to not just sit still and wait for things to happen, because she was constantly making things happen, or trying to make things happen for herself at least. And so, yep. So I think if we follow Jane Manning's example, we will be richly blessed in this life. Hey everyone, so I hope from these videos you're able to learn something about someone from church history. Or even if you didn't learn anything, even if you knew everything, all the details that I talked about, that you're able to feel the Spirit at some point as you have really considered the experiences that some of the early church members went through. I know that I definitely felt the Spirit as I have studied about them, and my knowledge also has increased. There are some stories that I didn't know that now I know, and I find them very interesting, and they're just cool examples in my mind. I know that we can learn from the past. Well, I know that we could learn from the past and the past choices that people have made, and so I think that the great examples that we had of these people that we talked about, and even the not so great examples, because some people did fall away and didn't come back, they can help us become better and grow so that we won't make those same mistakes. Thanks so much for watching these videos. Again, I apologize for mistakes that I made, or things that seem confusing or unclear, or just things that maybe you're like, oh, she should have included that in that person's biography. So I do apologize for that. But I do hope you enjoyed something and you learned something from these videos. Thanks.